Welcome back to Goldmark TV. I've got a trio of fantastic and quite timely things to show you today. Later on, gallery artist Christopher P. Wood is going to be talking about the origins of his blue paintings, his recent China blue paintings, which have been a source of interest, of obsession for him over the last couple of years. Lisa Hammond is going to be talking about her own fascination recently with horseeye, and we'll be looking at some of those beautiful bottles and vases with her new horseeye decoration. And in just a minute, I'm going to delve into the extraordinary history behind Larry Rivers' Boston Massacre portfolio. I hope you enjoy today. I've been wanting to show you this fantastic suite of prints by Larry Rivers. This is the Boston Massacre portfolio. And it's been on my list of things to explore for a long time now. With the current situation developing in America, some of the awful scenes that we've been seeing, I hesitated as to whether today was the right time to show this portfolio of prints, because the themes explored in it, the connections that Larry Rivers made way back in the 1970s seem very pertinent today. But I thought, if not now, then when is the time to show you this suite of prints? Because for one thing, it's a fantastic work by a really complex and interesting artist on a really complex and interesting and important subject. And the connections, the themes that it builds up are so pertinent today, and so pertinent in our human history over the last 50, 100 years, that it seemed like the right time now to have a look at some of those connections. The Boston Massacre portfolio is housed in this amazing reflective box, and a couple of the prints inside it have this reflective card used throughout. And I don't know whether it was deliberate or not, but you can catch yourself in it occasionally. It's fuzzy and blurred and indistinct, but there's inescapably something of you there looking back at yourself. And whether it's deliberate or not, it's pertinent because the Boston Massacre portfolio is one of those rare works. It's an historical artwork that tells us as much about our behaviours, our personalities, our transgressions, as it does the events that it's depicting and exploring. Identity is at the core of much of Larry Rivers' work, and for good reason. He was born not Larry Rivers, but Itzhak Grossberg, to Ukrainian Jewish immigrants in New York in 1923. He was the kind of figure for whom biography is not enough. He was a white secular Jew who played saxophone with black musicians. He smoked and spoke like a hippie. He swung both ways. He was an East Coast cowboy of extraordinary, colourful life, a purveyor of all things kink and kitsch. And he was known first not as an artist, but as a saxophonist who rubbed shoulders with the likes of Miles Davis and Charlie Parker. The term polymath is not really enough to describe the plurality of mediums and ideas that he explored. He was a painter, a sculptor, a printmaker, a musician, a one-time actor, documentary maker. Really, Larry Rivers tried it all, and he imposed his sort of awesome sense of ego and self-importance in works that varied hugely in quality, but always had something incredibly interesting to say, as we're going to find out as we go through this series of prints. Rivers, as I mentioned, started life off not as an artist, but as a musician. He was a saxophonist, very established, who worked alongside people like Charlie Parker in the sort of jazz scene, the post-war jazz scene of the 1940s and early 1950s. It was his pianist's wife, who was a painter, who first introduced him to art, who lent him tubes and brushes, And he was soon hooked, and on a GI Bill, because he'd served briefly in the Second World War, he attended art classes and quickly took to art. Rivers was painting at a time when figuration in American art was really on the decline, and on the rise was abstract expressionism. And in fact, Larry Rivers' teacher, one of his early teachers, Hans Hofmann, was a major figure in that world. Larry Rivers was, as in much of his life, an antagonistic and contrary figure, a contrarian, and he felt drawn away from abstract art and straight into the figurative world, into exploring the history of America and its people, its past, at a time when most artists were getting away from human behaviour and into the world of the theatre of painting and the arena of the canvas. Larry Rivers is one of those figures who manages to be both hugely undervalued and hugely overrated at the same time. His work has been much hyped and much derided simultaneously. He's often thought of as the godfather or the grandfather of pop art, like many artists are, because he was one of the earliest figures to really incorporate some of those photojournalistic aspects to his work, those elements of drawing from popular culture, from popular media and newspapers and film and television into the realms of fine art. Most compellingly, unlike many of his contemporaries, he felt that the people he was contending with as an artist were not his fellow artists of the 1950s, but the likes of Courbet and Jericho and Degas. And he took to a style of painting that drew on historical paintings of the past sort of 200, 300 years, and paintings that looked at the portrait of American society and sort of looked with an incisive wit at some of the contradictions that had built into the identity of what Americanism and being an American person, an American artist was. Paintings like The Last Civil War Veteran, after a painting of the disputed last survivor of the Civil War, Walter Williams. And paintings like Olympia and Blackface, which took Manet's masterpiece to task for its racist overtones, his send-up of Washington in Delaware. These were paintings that looked very much at identity, at the building of historical identity, and what that meant and how confused and complex and morally muddied that could be. The Boston Massacre portfolio saw Rivers returning to that convention of taking on American history and the tradition of historical painting and sort of inventing it anew or examining it anew. It was produced 2 years after he'd made a travelogue with a companion in Africa, where the two of them had nearly been executed in Lagos for being suspected of being mercenaries. In 1971, Rivers put on an exhibition called Some American History, which was a show that looked at, in a sort of quite groundbreaking way, the treatment of black Americans in the history of America and the continuing sort of systemic obstacles that were put in their way, the mistreatments of justice, and the violence and brutality that they've been subjected to in white supremacist attacks throughout the ages. The influence of both those projects, the travelogue documentary and that exhibition, can be felt in this suite. Some of those sort of photojournalistic, pseudo-cinematic aspects, the different colourways, this sort of set of scenes here, which are almost like a storyboard. Much of the sort of filmic quality of pop art is to be found in here, that kind of the language of screen printing, of montage, of overlapping and sort of combining flat colour with sort of reproduced drawings and photographs. It's very much the hallmark of this suite. The Boston Massacre itself dates back to 1770, when on the 5th of March, a group of locals down King Street in Boston started to shout indignantly at the local British troops that were stationed there in protest against colonial legislation that the troops were there to enforce. Through the rising tensions, a group of troops and a sentry that were stationed there were sort of embroiled in this bitter row. The captain ordered his troops to take a stand, but not to fire, when suddenly one of the troops was allegedly hit with a rock from one of the protesters. He opened fire, and the rest of the troops, without their captain's orders, shot into the crowd. And in the ensuing imbroglio, 3 people were killed and 2 people died a couple of weeks later. The event sort of proved a catalyst, an extraordinary catalyst for propagandizing and for revolution in America. There was a sort of a bitter war then fought out between revolutionaries and loyalists, and the event became a sort of a cataclysm in American history and the history of American independence from British rule. One engraver was particularly quick to get on the scene. Henry Pelham decided to draft up his depiction of the event. He put together a print, an engraving, but before he went to print, before he went to press, he showed it to a fellow engraver, Paul Revere. And Revere, before Pelham had even had time to set his through the press, went back, drew an almost identical version of Pelham's print with a sort of slightly revisionist description of the event. These smiling British troops who fire on their captain's orders, as you can see down here, into a largely placid and gentle crowd. It was a move that greatly angered Pelham, but that started a huge backlash in American politics, and it became a sort of a turning point in American and British history. You can see throughout this suite that Rivers reproduces a number of these prints, both Pelham's and Revere's and other later lithographs of the same account. You can see one down here. The troops lined up, shooting straight into the crowd here. Rivers' Boston Massacre suite really took those prints and that moment as the touchstone for exploring this passage in history and its mirroring, its reflecting in future events in the sort of 200 years since. What struck Rivers was not just the tragedy of the moment of the massacre itself, of the needlessness of it, and the sort of the complex contrasts between the oppressive rule of the British and their state rule, and the desires of the American states for independence, but also the contrasts of sort of moral muddiness and the propaganda war that erupted from it. And that's really what we get in a lot of these images. One of the main confluences that Rivers drew upon was a comparison with the Vietnam War, which was then still raging, still fresh in people's minds. So you can see throughout this series, Rivers collaging elements of the original scene with these aligned redcoats here, with these very famous photographs of Viet Cong troops tending to their wounded, carrying wounded troops and civilians away. These prints would have been produced at a time when support for the war in Vietnam was really at its lowest, and public support for the government action, public morale was at its lowest ebb. But the connections that Rivers was making were intensified by a number of very specific references, not just to Vietnam, but to the civil rights movement, to the history of African Americans, of Black Americans, and white on black violence. You'll see in here, in particular, the figure of Crispus Attucks, who was allegedly the first victim of the Boston Massacre. He was a half Native American, half black stevedore, a dock worker, who was shot and killed in the incident. And he becomes a sort of a cipher, an historical cipher, a figurehead for this moment for Rivers, a connection point, a sort of a totem that connects through to other figures from the civil rights movement. So we've got James Meredith down here. He's an activist who went on a solo march against fear from Jackson to Memphis, which was supposed to be, I think, a 30-day march, and on the second day he was shot by a white supremacist. There's another figure referenced here, Yusef. I think this is in reference to Yusef Koman-Yakar, who was a poet, but who had also served in the Vietnam War and wrote about soldiers' experiences in the aftermath after he came back from the conflict there. An important figure, both as within the civil rights movement, but also as an artist, as a poet, as a beacon for soldiers' voices in the aftermath of the conflict. But you can see again that Rivers exploring and emphasising, highlighting that contrast between the oppressor and the oppressed, between the indigenous population and the oppressive state, between individuals caught up within the incident and the overarching politics that drives events like the Boston Massacre and some of these other figures that we see here. But among the most powerful images in this suite are those where Rivers places us right in the firing line as spectators, as victims ourselves in this suite. And as a white man, it's a position that he evidently felt had to be emphasised. As someone who hadn't been a victim of the kind of segregationist violence, of the kind of persecution of the people that he was trying to champion in a lot of his art, in a lot of his projects. I think this was an important aspect for him to make people who hadn't been through those experiences get a feeling for what that might be like in this very powerful image of the redcoats lined up here. But I think what shows that Larry Rivers was an important, and when he got it right, a really fantastic artist, an artist who really understood the power of art to explore and instigate change and reflection on people's parts, is that rather than just confining himself to the obvious connections between the Boston Massacre and the Vietnam War, of other moments of more obvious conflict, he invigorates this suite with this awesome, fantastic neon colour. The sort of underground subcultures of camp and queerness, of kink, which were so important to him as a freewheeling young artist of the 60s and 70s. A lot of the cultures that he explored and which he inhabited himself were often persecuted in the same way, and the connections that are being made with these sort of these focuses on the soldiers as these sort of sexualized, idolized figures. Things like cutting out this head here and the sort of focus that leads down to this soldier's crotch. They all sort of emphasize that ability of camp and queer culture to sort of take authority figures and turn them on their heads, turn them into sort of sexualized images. You think of things like Robert Mapplethorpe's photographs of sort of people in BDSM suits and police outfits and chaps and that sort of thing. I think there's very much a similar thing happening here, but 10 years earlier, of taking the very obvious conflict and violence of one event and turning it and exploring it and contrasting it with the different sorts of subversion and authoritarianism that people from various subcultures were experiencing. I think that's especially felt in an image like this, where you have the very obvious impact, the shock and awe of being stuck right in the path of that barrel, in the path of that eye that looks straight through at you, but also the sort of the sexualized overtones of this sort of very fleshy pink figure that's being stuck in your face. This is the way that Larry Rivers at his best could combine these different aspects of politics and social discourse and social history and really ruffle feathers in the way that he put them together. Great history art, great historical art, like great journalism, doesn't just languish in the regurgitation of facts and the sort of explaining of context. It takes those stories, it takes those moments, those catalysts, and it follows them, it reveals the broader implications, it shows the broader context. It takes the single story on the micro level and expands it and illuminates what's happening on a much grander scale. And if there is any enduring message to the Boston Massacre portfolio, it is that violence is a perpetuity in human behaviour. The violence of warring states, of governments, of state suppression, of the majority against the minority, both fringe and mainstream minorities, the sort of toxic, sexualized violence, the fetishization of violence. It's all there in this suite, in this incredibly powerful set of images. Like Goya's Disasters of War, what it ultimately says is, this is something that we have done and it's something that we will keep doing. And it's a sobering thought to look through this suite at the same time as the riots and the protests rage on in America at the moment, and conversations that were had 50 years ago at the time of this suite, that were had 100, 200 years ago at the time of the Boston Massacre, 300 years ago, are still being had today, and they're still not resolved. But I hope that looking through this suite of images has reinforced not just how skilled Larry Rivers was in taking all the different facets of those conversations and the artistic, the aesthetic dialogues that were going on at the time and bringing them all together, but also that this kind of art is important and that we should take the chance to explore these themes and these subjects and hopefully find, if not a resolution, at least something that inspires a bit of thought and a bit of reflection on current events and how they might be mapped in the past and in the future.
One of the things that is of most interest to me, and which I've felt since I was a small child, was the idea of the imagination as being a key way in which to understand the world. For the last year or two, I've been working in a very symbolic, very figurative way, and using ideas which are inspired by mythology, folk tales, Renaissance painting and Indian painting, and also inspired by all those great expressive modernist painters that I admire. So it's a real melting pot of ideas. Never really trying to dictate to people what they should see in a painting of mine. They should sort of find their own way into it. And in that way, I hope that I make very open images in which there's a doorway into those images which people can enter and find their own way through. Well, this group of paintings that I've been working on this spring took inspiration from a number of different sources. I've been looking quite a lot at blue painted porcelain, both Chinese and English porcelain, and also looking at some surrealist works by the British painter John Banting. And he particularly did a famous series of Cibachrome prints which interested me. At the same time, I came across a couple of tubes of vintage oil paint, which was a China blue colour. So there seemed to be some convergence of ideas around making paintings which were blue. So I set out in the early spring to make a series of pictures which were sort of decorative and inspired by those sources, that were about a kind of spring in a more pagan sense. I'm using them as a way to make imagery which has a very kind of ethereal, slightly mysterious, slightly dreamlike quality, and have a kind of narrative, but it's non-linear in the sense that it's not a story that you start, there's a beginning or an end. It's a kind of series of images in which the viewer can plot their own kind of chart and their own journey through, so that people can come to my work and find their own place in it. It's a way of
dealing with complex ideas with symbols which are sort of understood and mean certain things. And in some respects it's a way of not saying things absolutely explicitly, but allowing the imagination or the intuition to devour the meaning.
I sort of had in mind as well Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which is a piece of music which always stirs me. So there's a sort of convergence of ideas there, which then led to this series of paintings using China blue, which is also known as Prussian blue. And the paint has a particular quality in that you can get very, very delicate light shades where the paint almost seems to change colour slightly, and these very, very dense areas which are very, very black and almost impenetrable with respect to the light reflecting of them. So as a colour it gives you a huge amount of tonal versatility. So that's the story of these paintings really, and once begun they're oil painted onto prepared paper, which is prepared with a gesso base. And the gesso base is a flexible but slightly absorbent surface. So it's prepared with a very delicate pink dye and then applied to the paper. This is an impervious surface so that the oil will stay at the surface of the gesso and not sink into the paper. So it makes it technically a very, very stable base for oil painting. And then the pictures were sort of improvised one after another, one leading to another, in this sort of pagan sort of spring. So that's the theme. And again, picking up on the surrealism of Banting and the decorative elements of porcelain, but mixing it all together with the imagery that I've become associated with.
I felt it was impossible to make meaningful art unless you believed in a reality behind this reality. And that belief in the other world is, and another side, and something unseen, is something which has endlessly fascinated me and stimulates my imagination and is the real stimulus for all my reading and all my creativity. So it's this idea of a reality behind this reality which I hope gives the art that I make a certain kind of meaning.
So we've chosen the hottest day ever to unpack a very hot kiln. That's good, and we've had real trouble getting those out lately. The big ones, I've no idea why. They just, I've got about 5 of them in the back of my car at the moment. I'm going to give to a friend to put in her garden. So it's quite hard when you chuck away, half your kiln. It's exciting for me to look at all, to see all these pots, the 3 years worth of work and the changes that have happened in those pots. You've got some new shapes and new glazes. I'm always fascinated, moving on a little bit each time, hopefully. Ooh, smash. Yeah, it's a big job actually, sorting them all out and making sure that, because you have to check everyone's not cracked, everyone, because has somebody dropped the box in the meantime? I don't know. Make sure they're all cleaned up and then catalogue them all and then describe them all. It's quite nice though when you get everything out. Actually, the next bit we've actually got to sit inside it to get them out, so that's going to be lovely. That'll be lovely. Actually, at least the sun's gone in.
Yeah, flowers.
Yeah. Nice. It's like, whoa, that's a lot of pots. Well, that's cute too. Well, it's a sort of consolidation, isn't it, of everything you've been doing, and I move on in my thinking with pots. Sometimes quite a lot. I get sort of hooked on things sometimes. Some of it was, at the moment, was blue. I was quite hooked on blue for a bit, and I'm actually now moving on to horse eye, which has become a little bit of an obsession. Oh, horse eye!
Ah, there you go.
Yeah. That's what I'm after. But I've used the end of a Hakami brush. When they get broken up a bit, you've got the twigs at the end of it, and I use that, and I've used that for quite a lot of things in the last few years, but now I'm starting to do this horseye thing. So you know, I love horses. I've got a thing about horses anyway. So, and I suppose it's till I get it, till I've mastered it, and then I move on to something else. So that's maybe my way of doing things. You know, I need to understand it and get what I feel is as well as I can get it, and then move on.
Well, as you might have guessed from that short clip that we just showed you of Lisa opening her kiln last year, we've got a number of pots here in front of me with this wonderful new horseye decoration that's become one of Lisa's obsessions, one of her fascinations over the last few years. It's a style of decoration, as she talked about, made with her hakame brush with the sort of broken twiggy bristles, which really suits these beautiful rounded forms. You can see what we've got here are a number of little vases, little subo, sort of flower vases and bottles. I think they particularly suit these sort of almost pebble-like forms, this wonderful round, generous bottle shape, which is sort of almost like a fruit or something, or a wonderful pebble that's been rounded by the sea. And it's a perfect kind of embellishment of that wonderful shape. The decoration, as she mentioned, is done with these hakame bristles. It's actually quite similar to the sort of scratched marks that you'll see in some of the pottery by another potter that we work with called Kang-hyo, a Korean potter. You can see the same styles of brush that he uses to get this sort of wonderful scratchy quality through the surface of the slip. Like so much of Lisa's pottery, this horseye decoration sort of has its roots in Japanese pottery. There are pots called umanome pots that were made in sort of the late Edo period in Seto, which is one of the major kiln sites in Japan, or the major cities with pottery at its foundation. And umanome means literally horse's eye. These were sort of quite large, often earthenware platters and plates, bowls and dishes that had this particular design on it, a sort of concentric circles in sort of 5 or 6 shapes around the rim of the pot that were supposed to be horse's eyes, or some people have said they look a bit like clouds. If you travelled along the Tokaido, which is a very famous travelling route, a very famous trade route in Japan that runs along the bottom of the country from Tokyo, modern-day Tokyo, which was then the city of Edo, to Kyoto, which was the capital at the time. One of the most famous, one of the most busily travelled roads in Japan. And it's said that in a lot of the inns along that stop you would be served platters that had this sort of decoration. But like so much of Lisa's other pottery, although it has its roots in that sort of Japanese aesthetic, and there is a literal Japanese precedent there, the way that she commands that technique, or has completely reinvented that technique, in those old pots, it was done using a sort of iron oxide brushwork, as is quite typical of a lot of Japanese pottery. Here, this has been brushed straight through the surface of the slip or the glaze. It feels so much Lisa's own, and I think that's helped by this beautiful quality that you get across the surface of her glazes from her soda firing. You can see in a number of these pots here the beautiful effect of that soda, particularly in these with this sort of wonderful tan slip. And I believe this clay, as well, is one that Lisa has included these little feldspar inclusions, so you get these wonderful little sort of pits of white that protrude from these wonderful blushed sort of and pock-marked surfaces that you get from the soda, from the wonderful violent atmosphere of the kiln during a soda firing. I hope you've enjoyed seeing some of these pots. It's something that I know Lisa's really happy with, something that she's been really developing over the last few years. I think it's a very simple stylistic device. It's quite similar to the sort of those classic enso rings that you get in sort of Zen Japanese thought and Zen Buddhist thought. And it's got that wonderful sense of circularity, of oneness and unity with the world. But I think in these pots, that it's a wonderful way of enlivening these beautiful glaze surfaces that Lisa has been been working on for so many years now. We've really enjoyed seeing some of these pots. Some of these here from her show last year, but there are a few new ones as well. So do keep an eye out on the website for those appearing in the next week or so. I'm just glad to have showcased them here.
We need to educate, entertain our customers.
Okay, so now we're going to look at some other of his prints.
Thinking very seriously about stopping making pots.
There's nothing forced, and I think his jogs are really the epitome of that.
Hello, welcome to today's broadcast from the Goldmark Gallery.
One of my most regular places to visit up in this part of the world is the Goldmark Gallery.